So we've talked a little bit about nuclear non-proliferation efforts, and we've talked about some of the diplomatic infrastructure, the treaties and agreements that have gone to help prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. But this has also been a central problem of U.S. foreign policy that goes above and beyond just negotiating treaties. It's about how to actively work and use the levers of American power in the world to prevent nuclear proliferation. And so I think it's worth maybe running through some of the phases or the history of sort of U.S. nuclear strategic thinking. So initially, when the United States develops nuclear weapons during World War II, the U.S. is the only country with nuclear weapons. It's viewed as the ultimate weapon, and it's there to be used. However, by the Eisenhower administration, it becomes clear that while nuclear weapons might give the United States incredible destructive potential, it's not a tool that can be used on everyday problems, right? Initially, I think Eisenhower was under the assumption that by having nuclear weapons, the United States would be able to effectively deter all sorts of different things, would not have to ever rely upon its conventional military forces. And yet Eisenhower was in a situation where frequently he was looking for policy levers to use, whether it was covert intervention or military intervention, that were something short of, I'll just blow everything up with nuclear weapons. So just simply having a nuclear weapon may have conferred a powerful offensive advantage, but it wasn't an offensive advantage that could necessarily be used outside the context of total war like World War II or a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. So that lasts for a handful of years. Then the Soviet Union develops its nuclear weapons and begins to deploy its nuclear arsenal. And so the United States moves away from thinking of the sort of monopoly on nuclear weapons to nuclear supremacy, right? That the United States has by and far and away the largest nuclear stockpile, the largest nuclear delivery system in the planet, and can overwhelm the Soviet Union. And so during the 1950s, this is sort of a big part of the thinking. And in the 1960 presidential election, President Kennedy is hammering on Richard Nixon about the Eisenhower administration allowing for there to be a missile gap that grows up where the U.S. has ceded nuclear supremacy to a Soviet Union that is gaining ground and building up a nuclear infrastructure that will someday exceed the United States. It turns out that a lot of that nuclear infrastructure that Kennedy was pounding his fist about on the campaign trail was essentially cardboard and props that could be viewed from spy planes, but weren't actually real. The CIA knew this, but it wasn't something that you say sort of on the campaign trail. Yes, the Soviet Union looks like they have a lot of missiles, but the US still retains nuclear supremacy because a lot of those missiles are actually made of cardboard and plywood and aren't real. They're just meant to trick us, but we know that. So it gets tricky, but there was this sort of transition phase, right, where the Soviet Union's arsenal is going up and the United States is trying to figure out how do you maintain supremacy in a world where you have massive nuclear arsenals being developed by a powerful adversary. By the 1960s and 70s, the United States sort of accepts that it's not going to be able to maintain a lead over the Soviet Union in terms of nuclear weapons and starts thinking in terms of parity. And so both the United States and the Soviet Union have reached a point where they're able to completely overwhelm each other with nuclear weapons, that they have just massive arsenals, more than they could ever use. I think there's a phrase thrown around in the Reagan administration. The question was, how many times do you want to roll the rubble, right? That you can wipe out cities. So we've got an additional 4,000 nuclear weapons in the arsenals. What are you going to blow up with those nuclear bombs? So reaching a point of nuclear parity, and then recognizing that nuclear weapons are continuing to spread into the 1980s and 1990s, and moving into a phase of nuclear counter-proliferation, of preventing nuclear weapons from spreading, and the increased risk that comes with the spreading of nuclear weapons of a small-scale strike. And so kind of thinking through that transition of these things are spreading out, the U.S. has no longer been able to maintain the sort of initial advantage that it has, and now recognizing that other countries are gaining nuclear weapons as well creates a foreign policy challenge for the United States. The good news, if there is some good news in all of that, is that currently relations between states that have large nuclear arsenals are fairly good. The United States and Russia are not on the best of terms at the moment. There's a tension in a lot of areas, ranging from Ukraine to election interference to Russia's role in all sorts of actions in Syria and elsewhere. But we're not in a Cold War type dynamic where the two countries are preparing for a cataclysmic showdown. This is much more traditional great power maneuvering, I would say. And so if there is a silver lining, it's that probably the likelihood of a life-ending nuclear confrontation, life on Earth ending nuclear confrontation, is probably reduced compared to any point during the Cold War. The downside is that you've got other countries that are seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, whether we're talking about rogue states. This was a term that the United States was using pretty frequently during the 1990s, referring to countries that were seeking nuclear or chemical or biological weapons or supporting terrorism. And that might include, Iran, which had been working on nuclear bombs and nuclear designs, North Korea, which did develop a nuclear bomb, Syria, which had nuclear facilities that looked like they were possibly being used for military purposes before the Civil War, at least, and then Libya, which also had a nuclear program that they abandoned in 2003. Any of these states could potentially develop nuclear weapons, but they would only be able to field very limited arsenals and would have limited delivery capabilities. This is not mutually assured destruction. This is countries that would have a potentially credible deterrent, right? If the United States attacked them, they would be able to respond in a way that would be incredibly painful for the United States, but would not be existential. It would not destroy the United States. But because they would be able to inflict this kind of pain, that would cause the United States to pause, hesitate, and potentially not move against them in an aggressive way. There's also been the concern and the fear of nuclear terrorism. And I guess I'll say there's some good news on this and some bad news on this. The bad news is that nuclear terrorism is really terrifying, and that there's potential with nuclear weapons to do untold damage. And so in the 1990s, there was sort of this scare that the Soviet Union had maybe developed what were called suitcase nukes. They would be smallish nuclear weapons that you could, cart around in a suitcase. And the fear was that when the Soviet Union collapsed, some officers at nuclear facilities just simply walked out the door with these suitcase nukes and started selling them on the global arms trade market. And so the US spent decades, tracking and looking and trying to intercept suitcase nukes. As far as I know, there aren't any of them out there that they've been looking, that the United States has been looking for decades, and it doesn't seem that they exist that I know. But the basic idea of a small nuclear weapon that you could roll into a city and detonate could be incredibly devastating. On top of that, if it's deployed in sort of a terrorist type attack, it would be very difficult to know who was behind that attack unless an actor claimed responsibility. And even then, an actor might claim responsibility and not really have been behind it. And so how do you use deterrence in that kind of a situation? Who do you actually retaliate against? A nuclear strike through terrorism would be a really difficult strategic situation to respond to and to guard against. The good news, I guess, and I'll just simply throw the good news to Thomas Schelling, the nuclear strategist from the Cold War, who's been really influential. And Tom Schelling, spent a lot of time thinking about how to deal with the Soviet Union, and in the 1980s started thinking about this rising threat of terrorism. And he concluded a couple things. He said, well, one thing, it's going to be really unlikely that terrorist organizations are going to get their hands on nuclear weapons, not just because these things are difficult to get, right? It's hard to get your hands on weapons grade uranium, and it's even harder to make the stuff on your own as just sort of a small operation. But the intelligence communities all around the world are looking for this sort of thing, and they are likely to intercept attempts to get your hands on weapons grade uranium or plutonium. So it would be very difficult for a terrorist organization to do that. And if they did get their hands on nuclear weapons, it would probably just be one. So that's encouraging. And then Schelling suggested that if a terrorist organization did get its hands on a nuclear weapon, it would be unlikely to use it, but would instead use the threat of it for policy concessions rather than as an actual weapon of destruction. And I think that's may be debatable, but what it suggests is that the threat of nuclear terrorism and of a nuclear terrorist strike might not be as great as I think people fear, for a variety of reasons that add up to this might not be the most pressing problem. Devastating, but maybe not the most likely pressing problem. In response to all these different security threats, rogue states, nuclear terrorism, and an ongoing tension with other countries that have nuclear arsenals, the United States has done a variety of things in the last 20 or so years, or 30 or so years, to try to respond to this new environment. So there have been proactive efforts to prevent rogue states from threatening the United States with weapons of mass destruction, right? So this was the Bush doctrine after September 11th, that President Bush said the United States will take unilateral, proactive, preemptive action to go after states that pose a threat to the United States in the form of terrorism or weapons of mass destruction. It's oftentimes thought of in terms of military action, but it's also includes other things from intelligence sharing to international cooperation to sanctions. There's a variety of actions the United States has taken to try to make it difficult and painful for countries that might be inclined to develop nuclear weapons to take those steps. In addition, the United States has used covert operations to try to erode the weapons of mass destruction development programs that countries have been developing. There have been hints, although I have no evidence of this other than my own speculation, that maybe the United States has had a hand in sabotaging ballistic missile tests by North Korea. North Korea's had a number of problems with their tests over the years. Whether the United States was actively behind that or simply knew that there were problems with North Korea's ballistic missile systems, unclear speculation. What I will say is that we do have a greater sense that the United States and others have been actively involved in sabotaging Iran's nuclear program. And so in the lead up to the Iran nuclear deal, there were a variety of attacks launched on Iran's nuclear program by the United States, potentially by Israel. I'm not going to attribute blame to who exactly for what attacks, but it included assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists. They'd get in their car and be driving down the interstate, and somebody drive up with a motorcycle and attach a bomb to the car, and it would go off. The United States used, potentially, we believe, a computer virus that would identify if it was on a particular type of motor that was used in Iranian centrifuges. And this virus was out and distributed and popped up globally. But the virus was more or less benign. It would just sort of wait to connect to any other device and jump to any other device it could. But when it found itself on this particular type of motor, what it would do is it would randomly give a little bit of extra pulse of electricity to that motor, which, if the motor is being used for something every day, doesn't necessarily show up in any sort of meaningful way. It just sort of revs a little bit unexpectedly. But with centrifuges, where you are spinning uranium for months at a time to separate out the denser, more enriched uranium from the regular, less radioactive uranium, those centrifuges would get going faster and faster and faster, and would eventually reach the limits of what the metal could actually handle, and they would break and send uranium spilling all over the floor. And it was, a cataclysmic program for Iran's centrifuges and enrichment efforts. But that gives you sort of a sense of the kind of things that the United States has worked on to try to limit countries from being able to develop nuclear weapons. There have been negotiations as well. The United States worked out an agreement with Iran to limit Iran's nuclear ambitions, to get Iran to walk back some of its programs that the United States was concerned about being used for military purposes. In 2003, the United States cut a deal with Gaddafi in Libya for Libya to give up its nuclear weapons program. And following a chemical weapons attack in Syria during the Syrian civil war, President Obama negotiated with President Medvedev of Russia to get Syria to destroy a good chunk of its chemical weapons stockpile. And so, again, these are just different efforts that have gone into trying to reduce the threat of weapons of mass destruction from rogue states and potentially having these weapons fall into the hands of terrorist organizations. The last thing that the United States has done during this time period has been to invest in missile defense systems. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a subsequent discussion. There's a lot of controversy behind these programs and how effective they can be, but it's one part of a broader set of policies that are all aimed at responding to the potential threat of weapons of mass destruction proliferating out and potentially causing a threat to the United States.